Hello, this is a short video on the presentation looking at trauma, how trauma impact the API community, but particularly giving you the definition of trauma. My name is Bith-Melander. I'm the Chair and Program Director of the Social Work Department at CSU Stanislaus. And I'm so sorry that I can't be there in person. Would love to. Nevertheless, here it is, my brief presentation or overview of trauma, how trauma impacts the community. I will start with definition and look specifically at API and stigma, global context, stories people tell, and then end with a conclusion on how trauma and that is transmissible and the difficulty to see its manifestation. I am now looking at slide number 2. Just to list what I'm going to briefly talk about today. And this is really an overview. So let me start with the definition of trauma. Trauma affects all of us. Trauma is defined as having a deeply disturbing or distressing experience, which can include a physical injury. It can affect the social fabric of a nation or culture. The DSM-5 criterion for trauma is very precise. It involves either direct exposure or witnessing in person. Now, cultural trauma is a little bit different, however. It's a complex conceptual process. It is deep-rooted at the collective level in an event such as a war, a natural disaster, or a genocide that took place in a country such as Cambodia during the Pol Pot regime. Transgenerational trauma or historical trauma is defined as the subjective experiencing and remembering of events in the mind of an individual or the life of a community that pass from adults to children in cyclic processes as collective emotional and psychological injury. And this is slide number 3, looking at the definition of trauma. Now, let me move on to talk a little bit about the manifestation of trauma. The manifestation of trauma, though, tends to be depending on what individual is experiencing and how the individual is dealing with that particular traumatic event. But the manifestations are either they freeze, they flight, they fight, or they fright. And trauma is a complex multi-generational process that juxtaposes conflict and confrontation, right? Confrontation means war, natural disasters, and genocide. And of course, with coping and adapting strategies, some that have been used include spiritual healing, cultural identity, mediation, conversation, conciliation, and negotiation. So these are sort of like the adapting strategy. And also trauma, beside that it's going through this cyclic processes or the cyclic processes such as psychological injury, loss of identity, cultural and emotional factor, plays an important role. Really, it's because we are a unique being in many ways. We are the product of our environment, and how we respond to trauma is different, right? Some can tolerate a lot, others can't. Some figuring out that traumatic events can impact them psychologically and emotionally in a way that cannot be addressed alone, right? You can't really self-medicate your way through feeling better. And of course, seek professional help. Others probably did not notice that. So we can dive deep a little bit later. That this is slide 4, just looking at the manifestation of trauma. Now I'm going to slide 5, looking at multi-generation and historical trauma, and try to give you a little bit of definition on that. So trauma or historical trauma attacks what constitutes a culture through the prohibition of the use of language that is in tune with the culture beliefs and values, spiritual and healing practices, and access to public spaces. And it can cause traumatic loss of identity and meaning, cultural identity and cultural conceptions of reality, for example, or evolve in part to provide protection against the most basic of all human fears. In other words, people are prone to anxiety and related symptoms if they have little faith or lose their cultural worldview, right? Our beliefs and values and practices anchor us like a boat to an anchor. And cultural identity and cultural conception of reality, as I said earlier, anchor a person's sense of self-worth and a sense of self, right? Culture trauma seems to inhibit both these values and are innately important in the survivability and functionality of a population. So without our values, without our belief, and in many ways, these beliefs that sort of manifest into some kind of a value or a foundation to help us deal with all the events that happen can be lost if one experiences from one generation to the next continuously with a traumatic event or trauma. That was slide number 5. Let me move on to slide number 6, looking at, again, transgenerational trauma or complex trauma or a complex traumatic stress disorder. The definition is that trauma is passed down from one generation of trauma survivor to the next and so on, down through the generations of the survivor offspring. The latter transmission tends to manifest in complex PTSD. The most obvious evidence, though, in literature on the intergenerational effects of parents' traumas concern those who survived the Holocaust, where individual experience PTSD, but without ever have any experience of post-traumatic stress or traumatic events that would lead to post-traumatic stress, and can talk about it in detail. And this is in part what they find out was that the parents who lived through the Holocaust basically ended up with feeling the symptoms of PTSD and pass those symptoms down to the next generation, even though the next generation did not experience any kind of traumatic events, such as extreme fears or feeling on edge, just constantly feeling anxious. So, and then complex PTSD manifests as a set of symptoms resulting from, again, repeated and prolonged stress of a social or interpersonal in nature. So if you have repeated trauma as a community and through time, your offspring or the next generation will more likely to feel the impact of that trauma as well. So this is slide number 6. Number 7, I'm touching upon some specific symptoms that you may see. Explosion of emotions or vitality of emotions. Hyperarousal is the other one. And pervasive fear, of course, anxiety, right? And this is an adaptive response intended to keep a person away from similar dangerous situations in the future. So indulge me for one moment on looking at, if we think about the evolutionary perspective on trauma, that these symptoms are meant to serve as a warning sign. But these symptoms at the same time created a problem or a challenge. They are detrimental to the daily functioning of a human being once they experience a traumatic event. Now, I'm not saying that all people will acquire all these symptoms. Some could just live and figuring out a way to cope with these symptoms. But there are others who probably are a bit more prone, whether it's because of transgenerational trauma or because they lack the coping skill to address these, what they witness and what they're feeling. So that's slide number 7. Slide number 8, these are just a sort of example of traumatic experience. And let me just say that traumatic experience is not homogeneous, right? Trauma impacts a community from one generation to the next. Additional violence experience after resettlement in America adversely affects the community, for example. And patterns of trauma, right? Southeast Asian in the Vietnam War, these refugees arrive in the U.S. suffering from PTSD with limited education, fragmented English proficiency. Many were prone to poverty, crime, and violence after resettlement in the U.S. So this is a classic example of repeated trauma as well. And then the cycle of violence and trauma continue with recent deportation of refugees from the U.S. to their native countries, back to the very situation and governments that prosecuted them in the first place. And the migration experience contributed to more trauma in the lives of some of the folks who resettled in the U.S., particularly API. You know, we see abuse and at the refugee camps with Myanmar population, the minority population, and those who have escaped the violence from from Myanmar, from their native country. Similarly, with the Southeast Asian, after the Vietnam War, after the Pol Pot regime, certainly in the refugee camps in Thailand, for example, continue to feel abuse and they experience more violence there. And then, of course, the issue of assimilation in the mainstream society here in the U.S. Created further challenges for them, right? Struggle to assimilate, may have undergone torture, psychological, physical trauma, separation, and loss of family members. All of these added, it's like compounded to the issues that they face in a new country, in a strange land, and then seeking help is not a simple process either, you know, considering the extreme stigma and shame surrounding mental health issue or mental illness in the API community. And again, API is not a homogenous group of people. You know, we have different language, different cultures, which complicate it further. One of the things that I wanted to stress before I concluded this, which is slide number 9, is that these symptoms people experience, whether it's PTSD or other, such as extreme anxiety, fear of leaving the house, feeling on edge, these symptoms don't go away, even if you build the proper coping skills to address them. Once you're under stress, the body produces cortisol, and we know that cortisol leads to all kinds of issues, including inflammation. And again, under stress, a person who already have all these symptoms, the symptoms, even if they learn how to manage them, can exacerbate it under stress. So a couple points. Again, trauma is transmissible. Trauma pass on from one generation to the next. And that's one area. 2 is that once you acquire a symptom, even if you develop coping skills, these symptoms don't go away. And then the final point is that stress tend to exacerbate it, if not resurface some of these symptoms. So it's important to sort of treat those who are being treated for trauma-related experiences should consider that this is sort of a cyclic process that and an ongoing support from family, from community. And healing starts with understanding culture practices, beliefs and values, and because those things are important to our identity, and that's what anchor us, despite the fact that we may have some challenges in the way we experience the world. And of course, the recent intensity of the fighting in the Middle East with the Israeli and with the Palestinians, these kind of dramatic events, and can really contribute to create a collective trauma or complex trauma of a community, and therefore through time we'll continue to feel those symptoms. So to address it, it's really to look at the community and what the values are and the beliefs, and to see how one identity can be explain and use these values and beliefs to anchor them in order to sort of remerge or resurface or emerge as a whole person. So seeking support is really important, and understanding how trauma impacts the brain, right? We know that our brain is a kind of similar to our fingerprint. No single brain is the same, and we also know that nothing gets lost in our brain, right? It's just there, stores away, and will come under a traumatic event. So in the most inconvenient time, all of a sudden you feel like you're overwhelmed. But it's all these past trauma that actually comes. It's just being triggered by one small event or major event. One never knows what triggers. And we'll call this trauma response. So it's important to look at those things as well as we move forward with understanding how trauma impacts or affects the community through time. and especially with API community, with us being complex with just sheer amount of diversity in terms of language and culture. And thank you for listening.